2, 1. Juergen Hahn. All right, first question. Maybe it'll take maybe this whole question will take up an hour. Maybe this will take up the whole podcast because you clearly have said you're an outspoken person. So I'm just going to give you a question. You run with it. What do we know about autism? What do we think we know about autism? And where does your research come in?
Okay. I mean, this is a very complex field, yeah, with many different opinions out there. So obviously, when I start talking about what I think we know, other people may not necessarily agree with all of that, but that's fine what it is. I mean, one thing that's really important to keep in mind about all types of autism is it is a very heterogeneous disease. A disorder. It's not a disease. It's a disorder. And what you probably heard the saying that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, meaning that if I meet a second one, they're probably very different, but they may still have the same classification. Yeah, meaning and so what we know about it is, let's say the current state of the art is that basically that it is something where there's a combination of factors that come into play. Yeah, part of that is genetic. And so the genetic makeup does play a role. But part of that is also what we call environmental factors. And I need to clarify that a little bit, because if I talk environmental factors and people immediately think, oh, it's environmental pollution. And that is one type of environmental factors, but it just means any influence from the outside. Yeah, so like, for example, if a mother during pregnancy was taking certain medications or had an infection multiple times, we would call this an environmental factor because it's affecting things from the outside. Yeah, both of these together are actually important. So so this is where there's some controversy. There are some people some people claim that it was basically that the genetic component is really important. That determines everything. I would argue that view is receding a bit, because in part when we try to identify what are the genes that make people more likely to actually be diagnosed with autism, it's not been that successful. Yeah, in the sense that people came up with a huge number of potential genes, but each one of them only has a very minor contribution. There's a few exceptions to this, but really they're very few, and they really cover as a very small minority of cases.
Like what? Take me into the weeds.
Oh, so one thing is like the Fragile X gene. Okay, if you have that, then yes, you will be diagnosed with autism. But that's like 1% of the people who do this. What about the other 99%? Yeah.
So only 1% of people that have that gene.
Well, 1% that have autism that will have that gene. Okay. So this is, so that's been a useful finding. You can screen for that. But if you don't have that, it doesn't tell you a whole lot. Yeah, and then people have come up with really dozens of different genes. So say, well, if you have this, then it's slightly more likely that you may be diagnosed with autism. But slightly is really that big. Okay, it's that even if I had many of these all together at the same time, it doesn't exactly give you a very clear picture.
So it's no real recipe to diagnosing autism, is what you're saying. How many genes are we juggling here, if you're saying all these different types of genes?
Well, we're talking about, depends upon we're talking about dozens, maybe up to hundreds. And even they, basically what it really comes down to is, and that's my view of things, but I mean, some other people will agree with it, it basically gives you somewhat of a predisposition. Yeah, so you may be more likely to be diagnosed with autism, but there's other things that probably have to come into play. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to figure out what these other things are. That's a big problem, because the reality is, if I know that something if like A occurs, and A is something I find in the genes, and if B occurs at the same time, then together I will have an autism diagnosis. I have to know what A is and what B is. I can investigate all of the world, spend all the resources in the world investigating A. If I don't investigate B, I'm not getting anywhere. Okay, so long story short, what we call this is you have a genetic predisposition, and then you have an environmental factors that happen at the same time is maybe the wrong word, but that also happens, and they can be removed in time. I mean, your genes usually don't change. Right. Over a lifetime. I mean, sure, there's some mutations like that can happen later, but that's not really what we're talking about. Then we have to look at both of this together, and where things get difficult. So if you want to study this, it's extremely difficult to run a study that looks at both. Yeah, it's very easy to take 100 people and then take saliva or blood and I look at some genes from that. But when we're talking environmental factors, I really have to track people maybe over years, during early childhood, and saying, so, what were you exposed to? What were you eating? What were you drinking? When were you sick? What did you get?
And then you're really relying on human error. You're self-reporting.
You're self-reporting, or in some cases, I mean, with the health, I can go to health records and see when did you see a doctor, but you're right, when it comes to a lot of these other things, I mean, there are human errors, especially when you're dealing with years of data you need to look at. And nobody knows, is the earlier data more important than later, or is it the same? This is where things get difficult. This is why there aren't a lot of answers out there. Okay, so we lump this together and we call these are environmental factors. Fine, but we need to really figure out which are the more important ones, and in particular then, what are they interacting with?
I'm glad you pointed out when you said environmental factors, how most people think, oh, that just means your environment, what's around you, because my brain automatically goes back to, in the 7th and 8th grade, my middle school was on top of an asbestos dump. And we played baseball and hours and hours and hours of tackle football, getting tackled on the asbestos. So whenever I think of environmental factors, I'm like, oh, what is that? It like, am I going to get cancer from that? My brain automatically goes back to that kind of thing. And you pointed out, no, that's essentially wrong. So social environment, your physical environment, your health environment.
It's a much broader term. I mean, what you describe is one environmental factor, but there's many out there, and many of them that we don't really think of in this context.
So that's your analogy to the A, and not really identifying the B.
Right. That's right.
Now, is that what, when people say genetic disposition, does that mean they're only focusing on one genetic aspect and ignoring that B and equaling, say, obviously we're talking about autism, so it's just like, no, you have this one, and you call it the X factor, whatever that is. So A is the X factor, and B is unknown or just ignored, and then we're saying if you have that A, that means you're genetically disposed to autism, but it's obviously more complicated, is what you're saying.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, what you're going to find then, if you only look at one piece of the puzzle, you may find that people who have this and this gene, they're more likely to get it, but they're a little more likely, not a lot more. Yeah? And the question then becomes, because some people who have these genes will be diagnosed with autism and some others will not. In many cases, the vast majority of them will not. Yeah, so you're talking about, well, I mean, I'm making up these numbers, but in this case, 2 people out of 100 will be diagnosed with autism, and if they have this gene, then we find 3 out of 100. It's not like there's suddenly 99 out of 100. Now, instead of looking at 100, I'm looking at 10,000, and the differences seem a bit more relevant, but we're really talking about things where we're saying, okay, well, this increases your risk somewhat, but that by itself cannot explain that. So you're going to have to basically look at this more closely. Yeah.
Do we know what we're looking at?
Oh, this is a really, really difficult question. So people have looked. I mean, people have looked at a number of factors, but oftentimes without looking at the gene. Or they're looking at B, but not looking at A, which is the same problem. I mean, clearly. A lot of the effect, I mean, people have looked at pollution issues because things like this, and you can find that there are papers out there that show that that autism risk increases if you're more likely to be exposed to certain pollutants. But again, this cannot explain it either. You're going to have to look at the two together. So let me get back a little bit to what we're doing differently. Yeah. I apologize in advance if this gets a bit technical.
Please get technical. Hurt my brain, Juergen. Hurt it.
I'm trying to keep it at a reasonable level.
No, challenge me.
So basically, if you're looking at the genes, they form like what we would call, there's a blueprint. This is the blueprint for how your body works. Yeah, let's pick an analogy. If you're buying a house, somebody made a blueprint of how your house should be built. Yeah. Now, admittedly, when you then come back and look at the house, that's not exactly how it's built, because somebody may have misread the blueprint, or they read it right, but they ran out of material and just wanted to do get things finished. The reality is that this blueprint, what tells you, yes, you're carrying this blueprint around your whole life, but what exactly is happening in your body is affected not just by this blueprint, but by exactly all the things that are happening around you. Yeah? It depends on what you eat, what you're exposed to. Yeah, we know that if you're exposed to certain things for extended periods of time, that's not good for your health. Yeah, same thing. If your diet is not balanced, there will be health problems in one form or another you get. So these are things that a blueprint cannot know about this. Okay, and but what you can do is, if I'm taking a blood sample, I can measure what's happening in your blood right now. Now, what's happening there is a factor of many things. It's a factor of part of it's genetics, your blueprint, but part of it is also called lifestyle. Okay, and but what's really more interesting than the blueprint is what is currently going on in your body. Okay?
So we could kind of disregard the blueprint to a point.
Yes, the blueprint affects this. Like, pick one example. Like, a lot of people are talking about cholesterol. Yeah, and it clearly is affected by genetics and is affected by what you eat. And for the longest time, we were very, very focused on what people were eating and saying, oh, if you eat a lot of cholesterol goes up. And then, I don't know, I'm not an expert in that field, but many years ago, the idea I come up like, well, your genes also matter a lot, and that some people may eat very healthy and still have high cholesterol, and some others may not be an issue. So clearly, both of these affect. But what you are interested in the end is that what is your cholesterol in your blood right now, regardless of if it comes from genes or diet, because it comes to some degree from both. Okay, and so we're trying to take basically a similar approach to what we're looking at. Is like are there differences in certain components in the blood? Yeah, in our case, they're metabolites. It's what we're looking at, and they tell us currently what's going on in the blood. Okay, and so and we know that the metabolites do depend upon both genes and environmental factors. And we basically look at metabolites in order to determine, for example, if there are differences in metabolites between children that are diagnosed with autism and those are not.
How do we know the difference? How do we know that metabolites are affected by both genes and environmental factors?
Well, it's a mix of things. One thing is that they are produced, ultimately, when I said genes are like a blueprint, yeah, your genes are first basically transcribed to RNA, and that's translated to proteins, and metabolites are basically related to that. Yeah, so they're a product out of a chain that gets you there.
Okay.
Yeah. At the same time, then basically you need building blocks to make them. Yeah, and these building blocks come from, from food, things you eat, and how your body processes them. Yeah, and so both of those, there's a connection there, and so basically one of the things that we've done is we've looked at children that we know had a diagnosis of ASD and ones without, and we looked at metabolites from both of them, saying, do we see differences? Yeah, and so that was the one aspect. The second aspect, and this is really where the novelty of our work comes in, is that traditionally a lot of people they look at one measurement at a time. Yeah, it's like if I get my cholesterol checked, yeah, then they take blood, then it gets analyzed, and I get this report, and the report says your good cholesterol is this number. And then there's a bound, and if you're within the bounds, then you're good, and if you're outside, then maybe it's not so good, or maybe they prescribe you something to take to lower it, right? And your bad cholesterol is also between two numbers, yeah? And this is traditionally, like on your triglycerides, you get a number. So this is like metabolites. I can go through them one by one, yeah? But here's one interesting thing. If I look at my cholesterol, they also tell me, oh, here's a ratio of good and bad cholesterol. Yeah, that's what we get, meaning that rather than looking at one at a time, they look at two together now, because somebody figured out that may matter.
Yeah,
That's
ratios matter. And actually, to your point about just looking at just sticking with cholesterol and how it used to be simplified, we're kind of still have that same idea that I guess the presupposition is that cholesterol is bad, that is significant. But we find I love this that you brought up cholesterol, because this is one and dietary nutrition, and we're finding from what I read, other people of course, is that cholesterol might not be as significant as we think it is. Like you can have as you alluded to, you have a very healthy person with very high cholesterol, and it may never lead to heart attack, stroke, heart disease, none of that. And it's like, well, what is the real number? Because we're still going back on 1950s, 60s, and we're like, cholesterol's bad, and it's just like we still talk in this normal person on the street. There's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, and there's a reluctance to change that attitude, and that no, you can't have high cholesterol. That's bad. You got to take medicine if it's too high. You can't eat bacon fat or anything. You can't eat any of that. But I guess the theme I'm hearing you're of course getting to is we have to analyze it in different ways, such as we have to ratio. What is the ratio of good versus bad? I just had my blood taken recently, so I'm right in line with what you're talking about. Good, bad, LDL, HDL, triglycerides. So please. But so ratios seem like a good idea.
Yeah, ratios, or at least taking information from multiple measurements at once. And for ratio, you need at least two, right? One divided by the other. And so what we have done is we basically said, there's a number of things you can measure. Like now in one study we looked at, there were 24 measurements, and you can look at them one by one, and there may be some abnormal readings, but just by looking at this, I can't predict if this person came from the group of children that had autism or not. Yeah, why? Because there's a big spread in each group. Yeah, for individual measurements. But if you suddenly started taking several of them together, where you basically suddenly you can build ratios, you can build some other relationship between them, then actually they're nicely separated into two groups, and you can predict, oh, this sample came from somebody that was in this group. Okay, now in my case, I know it came from that group, but the computer, the algorithm doesn't know that. So if the algorithm is able to predict that, I can then, in theory, give me a new sample from somebody where I don't know what group they belong to, let the algorithm predict where they think the person belongs to, and then let's check if this is accurate. And then suddenly you have a test. Yeah, no, not an approved test, but you have a framework for a test.
And this is the test that you guys have developed up at RPI, right? This algorithm that is identifying. Were you specific? It is those 24. Are you looking at 24? Or you kind of just threw that out there as an example.
Yes. We varied that a little bit. The original work you looked at 24. Yeah. Then we wanted to replicate that, but we found out that the data for the original test took 5 years to collect roughly, and it was expensive, and we didn't have neither the time nor the money to do all of that. But somebody had run a similar study, but with 22. But 22 out of our 24, so they're a subset. And so, okay, fine, we'll do with 22.
Close enough.
Yeah, and we said, but we're just going to use this to validate. We're not doing, the algorithm is not trained to find patterns, it's just trained to predict. This is when I said you pick a new person off the street, this is more or less what we did. We let the algorithm just feed this in and let the algorithm predict. And we came out that it got 88% right.
How surprised were you the first time you saw that?
You mean for the validation?
Or you saw your 88% validation.
I knew this would work. No, if you ask me when we went back to the very original work, yeah. I was surprised. There we got over 95% correct. Yeah, but we had two more measurements, and those two were actually really important. Yeah. I know what they were left out because they're more costly to do. Okay, this is why they were missing, but they actually gave very useful information. When I first heard that we get 95%, yeah, I was surprised because there's nothing on the market at all. There's no diagnostic test for autism. It's purely observational. The diagnosis, which
is part of the scariness of it, right? Is that you're counting on, it's such a complicated condition, and then you're just counting on somebody's expertise, their eyeballs, their knowledge.
I think true, but to be honest, I think the scariest part is that they have to deal with very young children. Yeah, is that I think people get very, very good at the job and very good at identifying this, but The problem is if I'm observing a 2-year-old, it's extremely hard to determine, well, is this behavior that I'm seeing here within the normal spectrum of a 2-year-old, which varies dramatically from 1 to 2 years, or is it something we're saying, well, this is a warning sign, this could be autism. And that's where this is so, and this is actually gets me into another challenge with autism, is that yes, we can have a diagnosis at people who are 2 years old. That's like one of the goals. But the reality is the average age right now is around 4 years.
That we're diagnosing.
Yes.
And in case this wasn't clarified, essentially the goal of your research is to identify earlier. Is that what you're trying to do?
Well, the goal is, that this is one of the effects that we're hoping to achieve. Yeah, but part of it is we also want to make it simpler. Yeah. So if somebody already basically has a certain notion that they think like, well, this could be autism, but I'm not 100% sure. You could run a blood test that gives you another data point and say, okay, well, with that information and my own observation, I'm more sure this is what it is. Because what happens in many cases that, people are observed, and if they're kind of at the border where it's not a clear-cut case, you come back in 6-12 months. And they come back in a year, and you find out, oh, well, now it's clear because the child is older. And you find out, like, well, I already had the suspicion this is what it is. And the parent says, well, you need a diagnosis to get services. Yeah, we didn't get any services because we had no diagnosis. No, you're telling us we could have gotten this earlier. Yeah, so I give you one example. I got a lot of emails from parents after our work was published, and many of them from overseas. And there are cases where people say, we have concerns about our child, our pediatrician has concerns, they want to refer us to a specialist, and the specialist has a 3-year waiting period.
Oh,
yeah!
Wow. And this is talking about like a 2-year-old kid, and
yes.
So you got to wait till they're 5 before you can think about. That's insane.
And we're talking about developed countries. We're not talking about the middle of nowhere where you think, okay, fine. We're talking about countries saying, well, they have a developed infrastructure, but maybe healthcare in some areas is lacking, and that is taxing. And of course, look. I'm a researcher, okay? We have a blueprint for a test, but this is not a test, okay? For a test, it needs to be approved by the FDA, and we haven't even started that process yet. That would be the next step. Yeah, but the other thing is that, people often saying, well, I'll send you a blood sample, and can you just do this? I said, no.
You're getting emails? You're getting emails from overseas. People want to send you their kids' blood.
Yes, and of course,
oh man!
There's several things there. I'm on the data side of things. I don't see patients. I'm a PhD. I'm not an MD, so I don't deal with patients. I don't deal with blood.
Right.
Yeah. Aside from that, even if I did, you can't just randomly process samples.
But that gives you an indication of how scared these parents are. That they're just like willing to send their child's blood across an ocean to a stranger because they're like, hey, listen, I have a 3-year waiting period. I don't know what to do with my kid. I want the best for my kid. That's kind of dire. Like, I don't have kids, but I know that feeling of you got to do everything you can for that kid. That's kind of scary. That has to affect you getting those emails.
Absolutely, and I've made it a habit that I'll write everyone back. Okay, that's even though I get a lot of emails, but I figured that they deserve an answer from me, and they deserve an honest answer. Because I even asked them, saying, "Well, if it's not available, when will it be available?" They're hoping that I'd say, in 6-12 months, but that takes longer. Okay, I wish it were. I wish things could be speed up, but certain things just take a certain amount of time.
Because this is such a serious thing that it has levels, has to go through, right?
Of course.
Like you're only at what, the second
Yeah, so what we've done is basically we've shown in our initial study that it worked very well on the cohort we looked at. Now then we had in a separate study, we showed that if it's a new cohort that we have no knowledge about, that we can predict reasonably well what's happening there. But again, as none of these trials were designed to basically get the commercial test on the market. Yeah? And so the next step is, so we've licensed the intellectual property to a company that was formed just for the purpose to develop a test for this. That's the only purpose. So, and they're going to put together, the draft of what the trial looks like that the FDA may approve. They will work with the FDA where they say, okay, fine, if like you need X number of participants in each group, and then we'll believe that this is good enough, assuming the results come out as you expect it to, and then that needs to be conducted. And this is the other problem you run into is, I mean, so far we've worked with the same group of people who, there's one doctor's office where they have C patients, they do the blood draw, so then there's some uniformity there. But if you want something to work across the whole country, you're going to have to work with different offices in different parts of the country saying, will it still work if another doctor is doing this? Because there's some variability that comes in.
What kind of variability?
Well, I mean, you're going to find that depending on who draws the blood, they have different procedures. That has an effect.
Okay. So standardizing this is going to be a big issue.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we'll have to show that it will still work after that. So, and that's the part that so far we haven't looked at, because we work with one team and they have their set of protocols. But if you involve other doctors, you can send them your protocols. But I mean, everybody has their own ideas. Give you one example what there could be a potential problem. Like some of the things we're measuring, they have relatively short half-lives. Yeah, so if I let the sample sit here for 2 hours and measure it, then it's going to look different than if I analyze it immediately. So clearly they can't do the measurements in-house, but what they have to do is they can freeze everything, so hopefully things won't change after it's frozen, and they ship it, then you thaw it, and then you measure. But if you make sure that either going to freeze this immediately or you're going to freeze it after half an hour or an hour, you have to, there will be variations in there, and the results may not be as good as a result. So you have to deal with those things, because every office will work slightly different.
That's real life stuff. Once you throw humans in the mix, you open up the door for so many you know that some of the issues, you know some of these issues, but there's so many you don't even know.
That's right.
Like, what are these people in Indiana doing right now? They took their blood, and then he went to McDonald's, and it was sitting in the car in the seat next to him. There's so many. There's like, there's just a lot of. There's just a tangled web. It's just, how do you get? That's just scary. I know what you're saying there.
Right, but this is standard procedure. Yeah, because it's just like, basically, if you want anything that's health related that gets approved, you need to show that there's a reasonable likelihood that this will work outside of your very, very controlled setting. Because like in a lab, we have a very controlled setting. Yeah, you work with one doctor and they have one protocol to follow, and then they may also not necessarily take everybody for the trial. Like if you have somebody, you walk in the door and you're saying, sure, they have this condition, but they have a few other things. Maybe I don't want them for the trial. When you basically expand the scope, people may use slightly different criteria. I mean, you can train them on what to do it, but there are always borderline cases. And those come in, and then you're going to have to show that you still get good accuracy even after all of this taken into account. And that's the part that we need to prove that. I mean, I'm quite hopeful, but that doesn't mean that it's going to work, right? I mean, that's why you have to run this test under these not so well controlled conditions. Yeah.
So take me into some of the science and the biology of it. What exactly are you measuring? What is getting you to that 88 to 97%? Like, what exactly are we measuring?
I'm not sure you want the names of the metabolites.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I mean, basically, for example, one of them is glutathione. It has many different forms. Yeah. So it's now let me describe it this way. The measurements we're taking, they come from particular pathways. Like your cells, or every cell in your body, they have a number of pathways that they're converting. Well, they're either signaling where they send information, or they're metabolic pathways where they're converting something to produce other molecules that your bodies and your cell needs. Yeah, and so what we've done is we looked at metabolites from two particular pathways, and the reason we've chosen this is the following. Yeah, is that one pathway is directly related to what's called DNA methylation, and the reason for that is that there's a lot of the work on the genetic side is where people have there may be epigenetic component, if you've heard about that, and epigenetics is controlled by DNA methylation. So we said, fine, let's look at the pathway that controls DNA methylation. It has multiple outcomes, but that's one outcome. So we've said, well, let's look at it. So our 24 measurements, a good chunk of them come from this one pathway, where we said, well, I don't know which is the most important one in the pathway, but at least they're all leading towards one of several goals. The other one that we're interested in is, and this is basically where a lot of your cells are, it's been found that children with autism, they have what's called oxidative stress in their environment. Yeah. Now, it has nothing to do with oxygen and air, but it has to do with basically, oxidative stress is just a condition that can develop really a lot of it has to do with inflammation, the environment, things like this. Yeah. So I'm sure you've heard about eat this and this vegetable because it's a strong antioxidant.
Right.
That's kind of tied to that because you're fighting oxidative stress. That's what that means. I'm not saying that just eating these vegetables will do a whole lot. That's a different story. But it's basically, you're basically trying to avoid oxidative stress. And it's been shown that a lot of kids with autism have oxidative stress. And so we said, fine. Your body has actually, there are many different types of antioxidants, but the body's most powerful one is glutathione. And that's naturally produced by the body, but obviously in certain amounts. Yeah. And so if you have a lot of glutathione, it should be able to reduce oxidative stress. If you're short on it at some point, oxidative stress may go up. Now, just because you have a certain level doesn't tell you everything else, because it depends on how oxidatively stressed the cell is. If it's under a lot of stress, it needs a lot of glutathione. If it's under little stress, it doesn't need as much. So again, it's not so simple. I can just give you a magic number and say this is good and this is bad.
Right.
Yeah. But so what we did is we basically looked at a second pathway that leads to the production of glutathione. And these two pathways are actually coupled. So they're not completely independent. And this is where our measurements, these 24 original measurements, so then the subset of 22, they came out of this. Okay. And so we had a certain, the reason we didn't just randomly pick something. You can get blood draws and measure hundreds of metabolites in the body. There's many, many more than we're measuring. But we said, well, let's look at a few that we think are important.
Why did those ones stand out to you?
In part because of this link that they said, look, if there's an issue or issue that epigenetics does play a role, it should show, at least there's a good likelihood it will show up in the DNA methylation. So, and that one, if your pathway isn't working right, the DNA methylation isn't working right. So I'm looking for abnormalities there. The same thing with glutathione. I said, yes, it depends on how oxidatively stressed you are, but the reality is if you glutathione does not have if you don't have the right amounts, then likely there's something in the pathway that leads you to not having these right amounts. That's what we're looking for.
The way you just said that makes sense.
Yeah.
Is oxidative stress is another way of thinking about that as a type of inflammation?
It's a bit. It's not exactly the same. Yeah, but oftentimes if there's inflammation, it's quite common there's oxidative stress. But
is oxidative stress is that really from the cell at the cellular level?
So let me. There's. It can be at the.
Sorry if I'm taking us down a weird path. You don't have to go there. I just have curiosity questions. You could totally get back on the track you were on.
No, it's fine. But understand basically that the level I'm dealing with, I'm coming from the data side. I could answer all the questions about our algorithms. I don't want to get too much at the medical side because there's some nuances I might be missing here or there. Yeah.
All right. Let's talk algorithms then.
Well,
what's an algorithm? A lot of people don't know what algorithms really are. They confuse it with logarithm.
Well, an algorithm is that you have some type of inputs, and it does something, and you're going to create something usually in numbers. Yeah. Now, in our case, what we're interested in is if I'm taking these measurements of these metabolites as inputs, can I predict which of these two groups you fall into? So that's what people call a classification algorithm, because they call it one class is the group of children with no ASD diagnosis, another class is a group of children with an ADHD diagnosis. Can it classify which group you fall into?
A predictive tool.
That's right. Yeah, and what's really important there is it's very easy that people basically they develop an algorithm that's almost, I would say, too complex, that's over predicting. Yeah, and then it happens. What happens then is if I use a data set that I already have, yeah, it will be really, really good and say, oh, we predicted 100% correctly. But when you then take a second cohort that you know nothing about in there, then oftentimes the performance goes down dramatically because it tries to find trends in there that just aren't in there. Yeah, and
Gotcha.
so you have to find the right trade-off that's saying, because the key is not just that I fit data. People always think if there's a curve and you have some dots and you connect them, as long as the line goes to the dots, everything's great. That's actually terrible.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of magic graphs and lines. Like, well, there's no line there.
Well, that's the thing. This is why you have to make sure that you want to make sure that, yes, you capture like the essence of what you're seeing. But if you're going through all the dots, probably you're over predicting. And then the key question, so if I add another dot or two that, or another 10, how good are you doing that? Because that's really what you're after. I'm not after saying on my original data set I can do this and that. I want to know if I have a new cohort where I don't know if somebody is diagnosed with this or not, can I predict if there should be? Yeah, and that's where overfitting is a big problem. And that's one of the things my group's been focusing on like the last 15 years. Okay, so
This has been a 15-year thing for you.
Well, on the algorithmic side, I mean, we've not worked on autism the whole time. Yeah, but given that I come from the data side, these problems that we're looking at, they come up in many different contexts. Yeah, so we've done, for example, a lot of work on inflammation before. Yeah, and then the algorithms are the same. I mean, the measurements that come, they're measured in different quantities, and obviously the health outcomes are different. But from the algorithm side, it's pretty much the exact same thing. Yeah. In fact, if I go back 20 years, so before I was a professor, but when I went to grad school, my professor in grad school actually did not work on any bio problems at all. So he let me develop these algorithms, and he wanted to know, if you look at the chemical plant, you have the data, you know is this normal or abnormal operation. Yeah, and the algorithms are more or less the same. The only I shouldn't say the only, that's the wrong thing, but what got me interested in bio problems that I developed these codes, yeah, and then when we applied them to chemical plants, it was boring. Yeah, in the sense, well, it was boring not because the chemical plants were boring, but really what happens is, it was a man-made construct. Okay, and the man-made construct, you build a plant so it's easy to operate. You're not interested in having it, it's fun to operate, but something bad could happen, right? I mean, that's a safety issue. So you build them as simple to operate as you can. And so my algorithms were total overkill for this. And I said, well, that's nice, but if I didn't do the work, you get the same results with things that are 10 years older, yeah? But then when I looked at bio problems, yeah, they're not built, they're evolved to be robust. And suddenly, then a lot of the advantages of what I had worked on, they suddenly came out on systems that were a lot more difficult. Yeah, and so this is about 15 years ago when I then started shifting to bio problems, mainly biomedical problems. There were a few what I would call biochemical problems, yeah, but over the last 6-7 years been almost exclusively healthcare related issues. So
I have several questions.
Sure.
What you said this about 15 years or so ago. Is that when we started mapping the genome or getting better at it at least? Is that part of your work? Like, hey, we're figuring out all these DNA sequences. Is there a way to put your algorithmic knowledge and apply that to what we're starting to learn about the genes? Or am I conflating a couple things there?
Well, okay, time-wise, you are this is the same timeline, but the problems I've worked on, actually, they're disconnect from that. I had friends who were more involved on that side of things, and the friends in graduate school. So time-wise, you're actually exactly right. But that's not what I was looking at. I had always looked more at signaling metabolic pathways rather than the genes which form the blueprints. Yeah,
gotcha.
For things, but as far as the timeline goes, you're exactly right. That happened similar time.
So to back to your algorithm, the essence of it is if you find this algorithm that you can apply to autism and you have a solid algorithm, it's not even so much about the context of just autism. You're hoping to be able to apply this to other areas?
Well, okay. In theory, you can, but where the challenge comes in, you have to have the right data. I mean, one of the key of this is, so what are your inputs? In my case, the inputs are these measurements in the blood that we found to be significant predictors. Yeah, if you wanted to look at something completely different, yeah, and I'm going off on a tangent here, and I'm not working in this right now, but let's assume you wanted to predict is somebody going to, like, does somebody have Alzheimer's or not? You could look at that. I'm not saying, like, there's no test for that, or no really good test for it on the market either. It's potentially possible you could look at it, but you definitely have to look at very, very different measurements. You have to figure out what are they. I have no idea what they are. Okay, and
so you have to identify your is cohorts the right word, or just variables, whatever they are, your data points. Because you said you have these two that you've identified for autism, correct?
That's two pathways.
Two pathways.
Yes.
And this is where I'm really interested in this kind of stuff. Like, is there a correlation between the two? And how do you determine that those were the two to target? And then how could you apply that, say, for like Alzheimer's? Is like, we need to find those two that apply to Alzheimer's as well, or whatever the inputs might be.
So I don't want to go too much on the limb here, because the reality is, it took me a few years to basically switch from inflammation to autism, even though there is some inflammation going on in autism. And we're still using the same techniques, but just to be able to talk to medical doctors and understand what are their challenges, this takes time. This is not something I can do in a few weeks or months if you want to be taken seriously. Yeah. And so saying like, I can work on autism and I can work on Alzheimer's, that's not really likely, okay?
Right.
I'm not saying that they couldn't make a 10-year shift or something and move somewhere else, but it's certainly not something, I wouldn't be surprised if a similar approach would work, but you need somebody who has the right skill set, the right contacts of people to talk to, understands the disease enough. I don't understand enough there to do a whole lot with it. Yeah, by the way, oxidative stress does play a role in Alzheimer's. I'm not completely making this up, but it's not something that we've done. Yeah, but on the autism side, we kind of know what questions to ask. Yeah, and I understand the challenges. Like, sometimes I think, like, well, why don't we measure this? This should be the best. And then somebody tells you that's just not possible. Okay, or measuring this costs more than measuring everything else combined, and we don't want to do it. Yeah, and those are things that, they're valid concerns, but they're not concerns that go through my mind if all I'm looking at where's the most information content. But practically, you have to keep that in mind. Yeah.
So do you spend a lot of time talking to medical doctors that have autistic patients, and who are these people, and how do you determine to consult them? What they tell you is important?
Okay. Yes, you have to do that. That's where my data comes from, because I can't see patients. Yeah, the first thing what I started out with is that clearly people have. You look at who's working in what field, like what publication record they have, what is of interest to them. Yeah, and I found a few where I think in that, okay, they're looking at problems that are somewhat related to mine. Okay, so like, for example, this is where things get, in my opinion, get really interesting. That first paper we published last year, yeah, that basically established this framework for test. The data from this was already published 5 years ago. Yeah, and I contacted them based upon this and saying, look, I want to reprocess your data, but I do need your help with some of the interpretations. Yeah, but and so people then argue, well, if this is already been published, then where's the novelty? I said, well, the difference is because of this algorithm that we developed, you need this in order to classify people. Yeah, without this algorithm, you could not. And this is the difference. They ran the study, but they could not come with the same results. They showed there's a difference here or there, but given a new sample, I can't predict what group you fall into. And what we then did is saying, like, no, if you look at multiple things at once rather than one at a time, now I can do that. That's the difference. But I basically pick people based on what type of work they've done and also what I deem to be more promising. I mean, we all have our preference. I feel like this and this approach is likely going to be more promising in the long run. And other people feel differently, and in the end, only time will tell who's right, right?
So that is the fun thing about the research scientists community, isn't it? That you guys kind of go to battle and determine and kind of pick and choose. Like, you find yourself in camps, right? Like, I'm in this camp. I believe these are the pathways. And then somebody say, no, you're way off. You're wrong. These are the right things to pay attention to. And then, so what camp are you your own camp?
So I think that, you have to, this camp it's reasonable approximately, because you have certain inclinations of what you think, where things are leading to. At the same time, I think it's really important to be open-minded. Yeah, if you see data that shows that this and this is not so important, then maybe you have to revise your opinion. Yeah, there are some people who feel like, no, we're not done with this yet. Let's fight this battle for another 5 years, when it already becomes clear that, maybe that's not exactly where things are going. Yeah. Look, if you're in your own camp just by yourself, then either you're a genius or you're a madman. Okay, so I would be very careful about this, because usually there's a lot of very smart people out there now working, and if everybody disagrees with you, then I would think you have to think about this.
Pay
twice.
attention. Yeah.
But if you see that there's certain trends going on, and the trends moving a certain direction, then it's sometimes important to reevaluate. It's like, is this still the most promising approach or not? Yeah. So I think that's a really important key point there.
So you are firmly rooted in the data side. Am I reading this correctly?
That's right. But a lot of that's where my expertise is. Like, you can reinvent, in quotation marks, yourself by looking at different conditions and things like that. This takes time, but but you have to have some core competency. In my case, the core competency is on basically the data processing. Yeah, if I change that, then I have to start from scratch again. And I would be throwing away 15, 20 years of education and experience. You may just as well pick somebody who,
Are there any competent people that completely dismiss data and just say, no, this is, you're looking at the wrong stuff. I don't need to know that. I know how to diagnose autistic children, and I don't need this data.
Well,
am I creating an imaginary person?
No, there are people who think that. So I think I would phrase it a little bit differently, but there are people who see data very, very critically. Yeah, and but part of it is, so let's give you one example. Yeah, but again, this can get very complicated very quickly. Yeah, so given that there's such a big heterogeneity, that among many different people who have the autism, they show very, very different behaviors, even though they all have a diagnosis of autism. So there's like one argument saying, why would you ever come up, or why would you think that you could find a test that diagnoses them? Because this person, they have nothing in common except that they have a diagnosis. So my argument there is that I think that's looking at it a little bit too narrow. Yeah, because what we're dealing with is, if I'm seeing it's what I would call some abnormalities in these pathways, you have to keep in mind that, as human beings, especially as young children who are developing, it depends on when are these abnormalities appearing. There may be periods where they're working just fine, and there may be periods when they're off. And depending on what skills they're developing during that period, you can end up with very different outcomes. Yeah. Now, I can't prove that if something didn't go right here, this is the outcome. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that just because people can be so different that the outcomes have to be then all the same. Yeah, so there are some people who believe like, no, you will never find the test. That just doesn't make sense. All I can say is that you can question the approach that we used, but in the end, if the data shows you can do this and you can replicate it, then Well, I mean, what else was I supposed to say? I have to be guided by what I'm measuring, right? I mean, you can argue that maybe some assumptions I made are not the most appropriate one. Everybody makes assumption. Like every trial needs to make assumption. That's okay, but you have to be guided by this. Another thing that I sometimes encounter is that people always, when they think about autism, they always think like, well, yeah, people are behaving a certain way, and behavior comes from the brain, and so we just look at the brain. Why would things that have nothing to do with the brain suddenly matter? Okay. Well, first of all, what we're looking at is, I wouldn't say it's nothing. I'm looking at blood, but what happens in your cells also happens in your brain. Yeah, so it's not independent, but clearly what I'm assuming that if I find abnormalities in certain concentrations in your blood, that there are certain abnormalities that may be a little different, but they're in your brain as well. So it's not completely separate. The reason I use blood is I can take a blood sample from somebody. I can't take a brain sample. Okay, sure, you can use spinal fluid, but that's not a measurement anybody would just.
That's far more intrusive.
Especially
if we're talking about little kids. That's not going to happen.
Nobody would use this just for a clinical trial to do some research. That's just not happening. Right. It's hard enough to convince people to have the kids draw some extra blood for a trial, but so it's not a realistic assumption. Yeah, and so there are some people who view it that way and saying, no, there's just nothing there. Yeah. But the reality is, and this is where, well, maybe that's too strong, the reality, but from my point of view is that, I mean, the behaviors that you're seeing, when people then also look at how does the brain structure change, because the brain structure does change, yeah. But I would argue that the brain structure changes because of the metabolic environment is different, yeah, or has been different at some point in the past at least, and that's so you're talking about what's the cause and what's the effect. I think that there's pretty strong evidence now that there are major parts of your body that are affected by autism. It is not just the brain. Okay, and I can give you one example. So there was a study that came out, and this is actually from author at the CDC, that 95% of kids with autism have other co-occurring conditions. 95%. Whoa. Clearly, that's not what you usually find. Yeah, one example is like the rate of children developing epilepsy. If you have autism, it's 10 times as high as if you don't. Yeah?
Wow.
So clearly, there are other things happening. Now you can argue that, well, epilepsy is also what you would think about is the neurons and the brain. But fine, let's pick another example, like GI problems. Yeah, at least twice as likely, well, not, I shouldn't say at least, but most of the studies say twice as likely in children with autism than in children without. That's certainly not the brain. Yeah, people start talking, maybe there's a gut-brain axis. The reality is, I would argue that at least in many, many kids, it affects different parts of the body, and yes, it affects the brain more than others, but there are other parts that are affected, and that's ultimately, if we're looking at developing a test, I don't have to have a test that directly looks at the brain to affect this because other parts are there. Now, when you start talking about how would I treat this, that's a different story, because then I have to look at what's basically causing something, whereas for a test, I just need to know, is it correlated? If it's correlated, I have a good test. Will I be able to normalize what I correlate? Will it affect how people will feel afterwards? Well, then you have to find out, is it the cause? That's a much, much harder question. And so far, we've only looked at really correlation.
Wow.
Sorry.
That I'm going to remember that. I didn't know that autism was so associated with other conditions. And actually, this is kind of, I don't know if it's ironical or coincidental, but about an hour or so before you came here, I met a woman, and she was talking about the podcast, and I said, hey, this is who's coming on today. And she's like, oh my God. She's like, my daughter has autism, and she was born with Down syndrome. And that was the first time I've ever seen anything connected. She's like, she has Down syndrome, and then she was diagnosed with autism. I was like, whoa, is there something connected with that? And now you're telling me this information about connecting to GI problems and epilepsy.
There's many others too. I just picked two that I knew the numbers, so that you don't ask me, what's the number here? And I said, well,
I don't need
know
numbers.
It's more, but
I just need
don't
your
know.
ideas, Juergen. I don't need your. You don't need to be precise as long as the idea is communicated. But you're saying there's just a litany of things that autism is connected to. I'm just learned of 3 of them in the past hour.
Well, another thing you find that there's a lot of kids with autism, they have sleep issues. Okay, now admittedly, part of the argument, but again, now we're getting into where there's no consensus except people say, well, maybe the sleep issues are caused by the GI issues and they're more common to have GI issues. Fine, that may be, but the reality is overrepresented. Yeah, and so one thing that you often find if somebody's diagnosed with autism, they actually have a checklist and saying, oh, and now you need to see this and this and this and this doctor because you're much more likely to develop this. So if you go back 10, 20 years ago, nobody was thinking about this. And you're right. If you, most of the mainstream news media you hear, they don't talk much about this, right? So you're not hearing it there. You really have to read the scientific literature. And maybe in 5 years, it will be more widely reported. But clearly there are a lot of, the co-occurring conditions are a lot more common.
I could take a pretty good guess why I say the mainstream media or just any media in general it just talks about autism as an isolated condition, and there's not much known about it by normal people. It's because the more I learn, the more complicated it is, and the more complicated it gets, the more scary it gets, and more overwhelming. And I'm like, our bodies are crazy. We don't know anything about them. What's causing what? And like you said, you go to a doctor and they diagnose you with autism, and then you said that checklist. Well, now you got to go see a sleep doctor. Now you got to go see a neurologist, or I don't even know all these doctors who would do what, the Down syndrome, whatever it is, take care of your epileptic seizures. Like, how do you get 4, 5, 6 doctors to work in conjunction for something that is just such a multivariate issue? Like, it's not just isolated to autism. Like, this is, like you said, there's a lot going on, right, and it's very overwhelming.
You need to make sure that you have one good doctor who's either a really good primary care physician or who knows a lot about autism and who's willing to collect this data from others and put it into context. And that's difficult. Yeah?
So with your research and your algorithm, that if you could accurately, somewhere between 90 and 100%, right? That seems to be the sweet spot, 88 and 97%. If you could correctly identify autistic children earlier and earlier, what kind of treatment is available for a 2-year-old?
Well, I mean, so the one thing is that you have some treatments, and this is, again, people have to think about treatments in a broader context, yeah? I mean, like you have early intervention services. I mean, this is a federally mandated program that children with certain diagnoses, and autism is one of them, you can get some help with. And what you get then, things like speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, depending on where the main weaknesses are. But I mean, there's almost a third of children with autism are nonverbal, even when they're older, or can't talk. It's a huge percentage. So clearly, if you can get some help early on, you find there are studies that show that the long-term outcome is better. Okay, so if somebody basically can get some help when they're 2 or 3 years old, it helps more than if they're 5, 4, 5, 6 years old, because it's a bit of a more lost opportunity. I mean, there are things like applied behavioral analysis. That's one of the intervention strategies that people look at. And this is purely, essentially, an educational approach, right? How do you basically teach somebody what are the standards you hold them to? Because they approach problems differently. Yeah, so those types of things. So we're not talking about, you can prescribe this pill in order to help you with. As of now, there aren't any medicines that were developed for autism on the market. It doesn't exist. You have a few medicines that were developed for other conditions that people say, okay, they can be used for autism, but they weren't developed for that. And
we do that a lot, don't we, with our medicines?
It takes a long, long time to get approval for medicine, and so it's a lot easier to prescribe something that's been approved for something else off-label than to develop a new drug.
Man,
clearly it's not targeted for that.
No, that's just a roll of the dice.
Yes.
Like, just, here, let's take this, see what it does. I've heard doctors say that. Well, take this. Tell me how it makes you feel. But
well, they do a bit. They do a bit better than that. Okay, so
I know. I'm really reducing it too.
I understand, but basically, I mean, part of it is usually then somebody's tried this in a clinical trial, and they found that some kids in the trial did better, and they were more, and that maybe the adverse effects weren't significant, and then they say, okay, well, this could be considered. So it isn't, I mean, it's not like somebody's just throwing the dice and say, take this. At the same time, given that it's not developed for that, for a lot of kids, it won't do anything. Okay, that's also, but that's the problem if you're dealing with any condition where we don't understand it well, because you first have to understand what are the mechanisms so you can actually develop a drug that deals with these mechanisms. So our interventions are currently, they're behavioral interventions. Okay. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this, that children with autism, that they have a harder time getting to new environments, dealing with this, and there's some who have a hard time with loud noise, or what we call sensory issues, and so you have, like in occupational therapy, you can basically train them to better deal with these situations, and the earlier you do this, the better. So if you had some, and that includes, but if they go to preschool, I mean, if they have a diagnosis of autism, they get a very different program in preschool than if you send them to regular preschool, because they basically target preschool for that. And so for parents, it would be very important to have a diagnosis as early as they can get.
And you kind of alluded to it earlier about autism is on the autism spectrum. Like you what was that phrase you said? If you met one kid with autism, you met one kid with autism.
That's right.
Do we diagnose something so complicated like this and just call autism to kind of open up? Is it like an insurance thing? Like, hey, if we diagnose you with autism, it opens up the doors for you to get help with what might be 100 different things, or I don't know, a dozen different things that we would qualify as autistic, because they're all very different. They don't even sound like they're the same thing, and what we call them the same thing.
Yeah. So basically, what happens is that I mean, just because you have a diagnosis of autism doesn't mean that now you're going to get this behavioral intervention plan, because that is really personalized for every person. So then, but it means that they evaluate you more detailed. What are your strengths and weaknesses? And then they're going to figure out what is the best plan to help you basically develop your skills. And so it's not that there's a diagnosis and they say, now you need 3 hours of speech and 2 hours of this a week and 2 hours of that. Well, some kids need that and some need very different things. And some of them may also vary. They may early on need more of that, and later on they need more of this. So depending upon how successful, I mean, the intervention was. But it is, I mean, what it shows is that the long-term outcome is a lot better if this is done earlier, and of course if it's done right. And so those are key issues, and so anything you can do in order to get people an earlier diagnosis would help tremendously.
It opens up all the options.
That's right.
No wonder you're getting these emails from people across the country or across the world. Like, it's so complicated, and you want to attack it as soon as you can.
That's right. Well, because the reality is, look, if your child's 2 years old and doesn't talk, some children don't talk at 2, but I mean most do. But it could be autism, but it doesn't have to be. But if you are interested in getting speech therapy help, then even if you decided, fine, I'll pay this out of pocket, so I don't need a diagnosis, you would go about this differently. It's not like I would hire the same person and do the same thing in both cases, and this is where this is important. So it's not just to, I mean, at some level it's financial to give people access to this through insurance, but it's some other levels you also have to figure out, is it the right thing to do? Because otherwise you're just wasting time and money, you're not getting anywhere.
How do you know if it's the right thing to do?
Well, I mean, as I said, if you know if there's a diagnosis of autism, you would approach it differently than a diagnosis than if they don't have the diagnosis. It's just a different speech. I'm not an expert on speech therapy, so maybe I can't go into details, but you will approach it differently. That much I can say.
So where is some of this, because this is such a confusing thing, and anything that's confusing has a lot of contention, seems to be, because I don't know anything about autism. It's one of those things that part of my ignorance, I've kind of lumped it away with ADHD, ADD, autism. They all kind of presented themselves to me around the same time in my life, and I'm like, I don't understand any of this. What's wrong? Why are we saying there's so many things wrong with kids? Is it really autism? Is that a real thing? Is it really ADD or ADHD? Is that just what a little kid looks like, a hyperactive, crazy little kid, and he's going to grow up fine, don't put him on medicine? But there's a couple different things tugging at me in that way. But if you're saying that there doesn't seem to be, if you are diagnosed with autism, if it's just behavioral therapy seems to be the primary or the only way they go, right? Primarily way to go. There doesn't seem to be much harm in that.
Yeah, well, not if it's done right. I mean, clearly, but the reality is there have been plenty of studies that show their improvements. That's one of the things that work. There are other people trying other things. Some of them are just nonsense or be harmful. Some of them are maybe promising, but the verdict's out. Yeah, this is one of the things that seems to work, and that's safe. Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's just, so. Let me give you, this is not completely technically correct, but I'll give you a rough outline of where some of this controversy comes from. Part of it is we don't understand it well, okay? And part of it is that there have been what I would argue slightly different phases where people come from when they argue like, oh, this is the cause of autism. And the reality is we don't exactly know, okay, even now. But if you go back 50 years ago, like people were of the opinion it's the parents, and in particular the mothers. They were just not nice enough to their kid, and that's why that was the theory a long time ago. Okay, and then people came to the conclusion that really was not the reason.
What, moms were mean to their kids?
Well, they said the argument was they were like too cool, not approaching enough. Clearly, that's just nonsense, okay? But that was actually the prevailing opinion if you go back 50 years ago, because the reality is people didn't understand it. Yeah, then there was a strong push, which was like with people like, I'm sure you've heard all about this, autism and vaccines, in particular the mercury in the vaccines, yeah, and part of that is that, I mean, a lot of it was driven by a research group in the UK, where actually the person who wrote a lot of papers on this was, basically, they were essentially working together with a law firm that wanted to not sue vaccine manufacturers, yeah. And so then people they hear about this, and then they get very defensive and say, like, well, I mean, look, that's a whole body of, I mean, in the end, the person they lost, I believe they lost the degrees, they weren't allowed to work, they had to basically do their job anymore. But people hear about this and they're wondering, like, oh, well, I mean...
they still did some damage. By
God,
putting
they
that
did
information
huge
out.
damage. I mean, they did huge damage in very many different ways. Okay, I mean, one thing is that putting out wrong information is people don't believe anything at some point. Yeah. The other thing is that any research that points even remotely in this direction, people don't even want to talk about anymore, regardless if it's fringe or not. Yeah, you can't even discuss this ever since. Yeah, because people just point towards it saying, well, this was all fake, and it was all fake. Yeah. So then there was a strong push at the time. Like there were some people that looked at twin studies and saying, well, if one twin had autism, the other one was much more likely, so it must be all genetic. And so there's like the vast majority of the resources we poured into just go into genetic research. And that happened around the time when the Human Genome Project came on board, except, I mean, we're 10, 15 years later, and nobody's been able to come out really with a test. Okay, much less with the idea like how would treatment change anything? Yeah, and so the trend that's emerging, I would say, and is that it's this combination between the genetics and the environmental factors that plays it. But we have to get away from just looking at genetic studies. Yeah, but that's still that's the main opinion you're going to read nowadays. Yeah?
Is that genetics?
That's exactly only what we need to look at, essentially. I mean, clearly that it's important. There's no argument about it. Yeah, but at the same time, you have to look at how it interplays with others, because otherwise, in my opinion, you're not getting anywhere. So, and we've poured close to $1 billion in research into this, and we haven't gotten anywhere. So now you may make the argument, maybe in another 10 years we'll get there. I'm somewhat skeptical there. So, yeah, and so this is where a lot of this, when you're saying there's confusion and controversy, because you got, I mean, looking back at this, some of this sounds like crackpot theory, right? And somebody says like, well, it must be the parents' fault or the mother's, but the reality
That's
is
gotta feel terrible. It's your fault. It's your fault. Your kid's like this.
Well, I'm sure it did. Okay, but that's but things have evolved, so people are very confused, and then it doesn't help if people fake their own data in order to for their own benefit. And I mean, then one of the challenges you have, and is that there's a lot of, I mean, parents do want answers. They understand that it's not easy, but they do want some answers. And if you just give them no answer, or say like, well, maybe 10 years we'll have some answer for you, then it's a lot easier to, just saying, well, somebody came out with this and this and this. Maybe we'll believe that. At least it sounds like an answer, right? So, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but that's where things, I said, you're right. That's where things get more difficult. Let me throw in another thing. I mean, you probably would like some controversy. You also have to watch out what I'm saying. Yeah, it's like there's always this argument about how have the autism numbers changed over the years? Yeah, because that's when people start worrying about this. If you talk about how there's a dramatic increase, and they get even more worried about the saying, well, right now it's 1.7%, and if that increase continues, where are we going to end up? Yeah, and then there's the other argument, and this is especially from people who push this all, saying, no, it's all genetics, that's what we need to look at, saying, well, the genetics don't change so quickly from one generation, so this can't be true, so the number must have stayed constant, even though that's not what we've measured. Yeah, and well, I mean, so the reality is, there are some curves that show that there's been a super dramatic increase from the 70s till now. But the data in the 70s wasn't as good as the data now, and so the people looked into like how much of this increase is real, and not all of it is real, okay? But at the same time, there isn't a single study out there that can show you that all of this was constant. No matter how often this gets, like every time somebody writes a study, you can read this all over the news media where they say, so your study shows that the increase isn't real. And then when you really read the papers, it's like, no, the increase isn't as big as we thought it. We can explain 10% of the increase, but the other 90% we cannot. The reality is there has been significant increase. Even if you take out the data from the 70s, you take out the data where we change criteria, those things don't help. But if you look at all of this, there has been a very significant increase. It's just not this exponential curve, but it's a significant increase, and I mean, you can argue all the way about these are the numbers we're measuring. Clearly, there are a lot of children and family out there that need some help. Yeah.
So the data seems to be undeniable that it is certainly increasing. It's just not as dramatic because, just like with anything, there's nuances. You got to really dig into the variables.
Right. I mean, well,
it's not the headlines of 1.7%, and that's good. That's a 50% increase over 10 years, whatever the silly numbers that the media throws out there that people like me just read headlines.
But in this case, the headlines often they go the other way. I mean, so it's 1.7% right now. It's almost doubled in the last 10, 15 years, which is very significant. Yeah. But it's like there's people right now. I think what the current number is 1 in 58. And if you go to the 70s, it was like 1 in 2,000 or something like this. Yeah, so of course that looks like super dramatic. Yeah, but at the same time, if I ignore all of this, it went from 1 in 100 and something to 1 in 58. Yeah, within 10, 15 years. That's a very significant increase. Yeah, and we have. We've even done some studies where we left out when we changed the criteria and just looked over like a 10-year period or so, and you have an increase there. I mean, there are some factors contribute, but the reality is the numbers have been increasing. So, I don't know why. So you can ask me that. I don't have an answer for you exactly why. Yeah, but it would help if we start looking at this rather than just saying that the number shouldn't have increased because of what I believe and then take it from there. That's, in my opinion, starting at the wrong end. Yeah, and that's what gets people scared. Okay.
It is scary. It is scary, especially. I don't know. My brain starts connecting all of the things that we're getting unhealthier at. We're getting larger. heart attacks are increasing, cancer is increasing, obesity is increasing, all this bad stuff is going up, and then we throw autism in there too. My dumb brain says, all right, there's got to be something connected. We can't just be continually getting unhealthier and more and more. Right? There's got to be some kind of factors, some kind of these environmental factors, unless our genes are going haywire.
Well, the genes are not going haywire. I mean, but the thing is that a lot of the things you may, I guarantee you that they have very different reasons why they're happening. I mean, that obviously,
right.
Obviously the average weight of the population and the level of heart attack, that there's some link, but I think
for me,
that
nutrition
is disconnect from the autism rate.
Maybe, right? I mean, it should be. But
for the most part.
I think everything so much boils down to nutrition. If you have unhealthy parents eating unhealthy, having babies, it kind of just, there's a little logical connection there that says, okay, you're going to produce a baby that is lacking nutrition. Maybe whatever's going on with the body, maybe that's part of it. If you have obese mom, obese dad, not eating right, McDonald's, smoking, drinking throughout pregnancy, you're going to produce a baby. And I know I'm just being, I'm generalizing, but that's just, I can't help but think there's some kind of connection.
Those are environmental factors worth looking at. I mean, people have looked at some of them and found that some of that has somewhat of an effect. Yeah. I mean, clearly, I think nutrition is important. And it's something that's, but what makes it hard is nutrition is very hard to study. Okay, because we've been trained to think about these clinical trials where we have two groups and they do exactly the same thing, with the exception of one thing we're changing, right? And then that one thing we analyze what effect it has. With nutrition, I mean, people live their lives, right? I can't track them over a 2-year period. Yeah, fine, maybe the one had more weight gain than the other, and maybe they eat unhealthier, but it's not. You can't go back to what was the determining factor for the outcome. This is what makes it hard to study, and that's why we're still talking about the role of cholesterol now, even though we've been talking about it for decades, because it's very hard to study. Yeah. It doesn't work. It's not as nicely as a 1-week trial with 2 people in a very controlled environment, or not more than 2, but 2 groups of people in very controlled environments, and that's the problem.
I feel like guys like you, people in the academic research world, medical world, you're just in the business of questions. There's no answers. Like, parents come to doctors and want answers. They're emailing. They're emailing and wanting answers, and doctors are like, I don't know sometimes, right? I don't know what this is. But it's really like, it's a question business. There's so many unanswered questions that we have. And do we see a light at the tunnel anywhere?
Well, I view this differently. I mean, this is, as an academic, our role is to ask questions. Yeah, we have to, we have to be able to provide answers for the questions too, but our role is...
But people go to doctors for answers.
That's different, because you go in there because you have a certain particular problem. I mean, doctors usually health problem, that's why you want a solution for that. And in academics, we're thinking about, so what are the challenges we want to face? If you ever run out of saying, there's no more questions to ask, that would be a very boring... I mean, either your research went into a direction where this is a dead field where there are no more questions, which is unlikely, or it's just something, or you just don't have the right imagination for it. But I mean, there are always questions to ask. You know? What's important is sometimes to basically ask both questions that are intellectually interesting to us, but also that have the impact for other people. I mean, that's important to keep in mind, that we want to solve problems that,
professional problem solver. That's kind of what what you become, right? Because in the end, your students, you ask them questions. You're trying to, or your grad students, you try to poke holes into the theory that they develop, right? And they have to have proper answers for it. That goes along with the job. Yeah. So if this has just been 15 years or so, are we at the nascent stages of autism research, and your research specifically, your field? Is this like Copernicus level? Like, hey, the world is round, hey, it goes around the sun kind of metaphor? Like, we don't know so much, but we're pretty sure we know this thing.
I wouldn't even go that far. I think there's a lot to be discovered. I mean, look, that ranges from you have to have a more complete picture on, for example, what how the body is involved in this and how our cells involved in this. I don't think we really understand. I mean, if you're having discussions about how more likely you're going to get, let's say, GI issues and epilepsy at the same time, and we don't really have no idea why, or that's not complete. We have some theories, but they're very hard to test. We don't really. I mean, there's an argument about, well, to what degree do environmental factors matter at all, right? And if you're having that debate, I think we're in a very, very early stage. The reality is you can't come up with any medical treatments if you don't really understand what you're trying to treat. Because you can't say that, well, I want somebody with autism to feel better. Well, that's great, but why are they not feeling well? Okay, you have to be able to quantify this. There has to be certain things in the body, certain elements you need to either raise or lower or something like this. You have to have a target. And that's there's clearly I have my set of theories based upon what I've been doing. Otherwise I wouldn't be doing what I'm working on. But I also understand that that's not the complete picture. And a lot of people may not agree with this at all. But we'll see. If every step towards having something more established makes me a check mark in my book, then I'm saying, I guess things are looking pretty good for me right now.
So incremental. The goal is incremental progress, right? Like
there's no
other way.
No, you're not gonna have suddenly nobody's gonna have a huge breakthrough suddenly saying, "Oh, I did this in my garage and I figured this out."
Right.
That doesn't happen.
So, do we know our current rate of misdiagnosing autism, and is that something that your algorithm and your research is going to try to reel in?
Okay, well, that's a very, very difficult problem. Okay, in the sense that. So you're talking about if I diagnose somebody with autism and they don't have the condition. In theory, we should be. In theory, I would hope that my algorithm should be able to deal with that. But you need. You would then essentially have to recruit a class of people that, what I would argue, are probably relatively mildly affected. Because if they're strongly affected, you're not going to misdiagnose them. If they're mildly affected, where do you draw the line, right? There's a line somewhere between saying, well, this has a diagnosis, and this is somebody who maybe they have some somewhat peculiar social behaviors, but it's within normal parameters, right? And in fact, I would make the argument even further. There are people who have an autism diagnosis who are able to lead normal lives. That happens too. Now those are the ones that they get a lot of press. They don't represent the whole group, and but that does happen too. And then the question is, well, in those cases, if they can lead a normal life and they're happy doing that, then whatever I do will not affect them one way or the other, because they should just go about leading their normal lives. Maybe we have to rethink where do you draw the boundary for somebody having a condition. But if you're talking about, and this is important to keep in mind, that a third are nonverbal or can't verbally communicate, and maybe that number is a little outdated, but last year about 90% will not be able to independently live. That sounds to me like this is affecting your life.
90%. Wow.
Yeah, you can.
Wow.
I may be off a little bit, but that's the vast. Yeah, that's kind of what it looks like. Okay, and that is something I'm concerned about. Okay, and the other things I'm concerned about. This is what people underestimate. 1.7% is a pretty large number. And then add to that boys are far more likely to get it than girls, and you actually have a very, very high percentage of boys that will be diagnosed with autism nowadays. That's if they can't independently live later on, they're going to have very limited productivity. Most of them will need help.
Wow.
And that's something that we as a society have to think about. And I think those are very, very important questions. And this is why I'm getting somewhat cynical when I'm hearing about people still trying to analyze, like, well, maybe the increase wasn't as much as it was. Well, these are the numbers right now. And even if these numbers don't increase any further, do we actually have? Do we have enough capacities? Like, do schools have enough capacities to deal with special needs kids? What do you do when people grow out of the school system but they can't work? Are they just going to move in with the parents, and are they equipped to do that? Do we have facilities where they can actually later on, lead lives to the degree possible? This isn't one. This isn't one where one in a few thousand we're saying, we can easily handle that. This is a huge number.
So let me make sure I understand this correct. Is it so that 1.7% number, is that 1.7 of the population?
Yes.
So are we looking at what, 5 million ish? If we say like there's 330 million people in the United States, so 5 million. You're saying 90% of those 5 million people. That's rough numbers. This is just for ideas. But that's a big number. Let's say it's between 4 and 5 million, and 90% of those can't live on their own. Of those people can't live on their own.
Yeah, but not without help, yes. Well, the one thing and this is where things get funny, I would argue it's not 5 million, because if you go back 30 years ago, there weren't as many people around. Some people would argue that the number's always been the same. Well, in that case, it should be 5 million, yes. And,
let's even say million.
But if you wait long enough that this 1.7% stays constant, which, by the way, in the past it hasn't. Okay, just from 2016 to 2018, it jumped from 1.5 to 1.7%. Yeah, so that doesn't seem like much, but you do this a few years in a row.
10% increase, 10% increase, 10% increase, 10%. Before you know it, we have a scare. It's already scary now. Anytime there's 1.7% of people that are afflicted by something that could be so debilitating,
it certainly is.
But there's variability like that. Like you said, some of the people you see, you just reminded me of someone maybe a decade or so ago. There was this high school basketball player, this kid, maybe my first introduction to somebody with autism. Is just because it was just thrown around as a word, but I never associated it with a person, never saw what it looked like. And there was this high school basketball player who they said was autistic, and he came off the bench and just hit 13 3-pointers in a row or something ridiculous, something crazy, and they had it all in video. I'm like, this is insane, that's amazing. And then they interviewed the kid after, and like, oh yeah, he's autistic. And I was like, okay, what's this interview gonna look like? Totally just normal, friendly kid. And I got kind of confused by that. I'm like, there's something wrong with that kid? I don't understand it. He's incredible at basketball, he just did that, and he's clearly has some social skills, being able to talk to a camera, and he was on a basketball team, and his teammates loved him. So it was very...
It may be somebody who was mildly affected by it. There are people around like that. But it's not...
So is that somebody that could be that 10% that can function on their own, essentially? Is that kind of what that person sounds like?
What you're describing sounds to me very much like it.
Yeah, that's what... I'm like, wait, this isn't that big of a problem, right? But maybe the word mild wasn't a prefix to that.
Look, I don't know this person, but from what... So I don't want to make it...
I only know from a 5-minute clip.
But the reality is, there are some people who clearly, you read these stories. If they have friends, and some people even have families, and then, if you have family, you have jobs, you have friends, that sounds pretty good to me, regardless if you have it diagnosed or not. But that's not what the majority is like. Yeah, and I think it's important to it's very. People like to hear success stories, and that's good. Yeah, and but I do think this is where it's important to look at this. It's very heterogeneous. There are some people who are very well functioning, and then there's some people who are struggling in all kinds of manners. Yeah, and so we shouldn't treat them all the same. Well, we should treat everybody with respect and so on, but if you think about what we need to do for them, it's very different. In one case, they may not need any help or very little. In some other cases, they may need a whole lot. But we need to be understanding that there's this big difference. No?
I would feel that say somebody like that basketball playing kid and other examples of mildly autistic people that are functioning just fine. They seem to be functioning just fine. That certainly they seem to be advocates for just the whole awareness of autism. Good. Is like, okay, I'm not severe, but people are way worse off than me, and so it's important that you see what somebody with autism can do. It raised my awareness. That was the first time it was ever really on my radar, and that had an impact on me, because ever since then I'm like, what is autism? It's that spectrum. Well, that's the name, right? It was an ASD.
ASD stands Autism Spectrum Disorder. Yeah, because it is a very broad spectrum and different. I mean, the reality. So if I give a presentation somewhere, I usually ask for, so who here, raise your hands if you know somebody with autism. And there's an awful lot of people. Usually, the majority of hands go up. They know somebody. So clearly, there's quite a bit of awareness. There's not necessarily always as much awareness of what that means. Yeah, I mean, sure, if it's a brother or a son or daughter, then it's a lot more than if it's some distant cousin. But clearly, there are a lot of people that have met somebody with this diagnosis.
So take me down to the pavement. What does a normal day for Juergen look like? When you walk into the office, when you wake up in the morning, assuming you wake up at home and then you go to the office, what is a typical day of a researcher?
So first of all, I mean, my job, I wear multiple hats on my job. Okay, I'm a professor, but I'm also a department head. Okay, so I'm part-time administrator. I mean, my normal day is that I get to the office. I have to first of all go through all the emails I got through the night. Okay, I mean, there's a lot of junk, but there's also some important ones in there. And sometimes there are things like saying we need this by 10 o'clock or so.
Other ones,
I better get this out of the way,
right?
So that's the first thing. I mean, the majority of my time right now I actually spent running the biomedical engineering department. Then I do spend some time. It's a summer. We have very few classes. I don't teach during the summer. I spend some time with my grad students, so I give them a bit more guidance on. Like I can meet with them daily now, which is hard during the regular semester. And then of course there's. We always have to write papers and grants. Okay, you have to figure out how do I pay my students, right? And so that's a constant in there. And then during the regular semester, I do teach as well, and so you also have to basically then make sure that you're up on the material. You've got the next homework or test made up, and those types of things. Yeah.
It would seem like there's a benefit to wearing multiple hats with this kind of thing.
Well, it's a mix. I mean, you always wear multiple hats, and that we would like to have. I mean, our tenure track faculty, they should do research and teaching because they go together. Yeah, in the end, some of the research results are really cool and new and cutting edge. You want to bring it to a classroom and get people excited because they get to see things like, you won't hear about this for another 3 years, but I just told you.
Ooh, that's fun. That's fun.
So, and. Well, I mean, look at it this way. In the end, we're trying to prepare them so that they're ready when they graduate. We don't want to prepare them for stuff that was important 5-10 years ago, right? So when they start, we want to prepare them for the jobs they may hold in 4 or 5 years when they graduate, not the jobs they should have had 4 or 5 years ago. And so we have to think ahead about what we think are the trends. And so that goes together. At the same time, I think the teaching kind of grounds you. Yeah, because it's very easy as a researcher saying, let's ask all these tough questions and go off in some direction. But it kind of brings you back saying, okay, well, what does this at the broader level, what effect does this have? Yeah, and I think it's helpful there. Now, the administrative job, that's a different story. I mean, somebody needs to run the department. I've been doing this, I'm in my 6th year now, so it's been a while. And that's an important job because ultimately it is not, I mean, it's not just paperwork, but you have to make some strategic decisions, which directions to go. Yeah, you look at your undergrad program, is it still really what you want it to be, or there's some new cool skills that you see on the horizon that your students should have in 3, 4, 5 years, which means we need to think about teaching them now, right? Because they will be here in a few years. And the same thing in research. If you think that there's a really big new thing coming up, then are we positioned the right way to get into this, or do I need to hire somebody with the right skill set? So that's all that goes together.
So as a department head of biomedical engineering, what do most of your students get into? Or do they tend to turn into MDs? Are you teaching doctors? Are you teaching our future doctors?
Well, we have some that do that, but the majority do not. I mean, about 10% of our students actually go to medical school, so we have a sizable proportion. We have about 35% that go to grad school, and a little more than half actually finish with a bachelor's and get a job. Yeah, and so that's usually what we have. So there are some medical doctors in there, but the majority of our students are not medical doctors. But or I'm not on the trajectory to go to med school. But at the same time, yes, you do have a sizable portion of people who want to go there, because ultimately it's easier from biomedical engineering to go into medical school, and let's say if you're civil engineering. I'm not saying you can't do it, but there's a lot of requirements about working on cells and human body works and the biology that they have to take as part of our curriculum anyway, whereas with some other curriculum they have to add this on. So it's biology, biophysics, and School of Science. Those are typical majors for people who are interested in that. And if you want to be an engineer, biomedical is pretty natural, and that's why we have a higher percentage.
Well, Juergen, I'm glad brains like you exist and you're tackling important, difficult, insanely difficult topics, and I definitely appreciate your time here today, because I came in as maybe a 1 out of 100 as far as understanding of autism, and I'm walking away with maybe like a 30. Maybe like a 30, which is I'm impressed. I'm impressed if I can retain any of this. All right, Juergen Hahn, RPI. I really appreciate this, man. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care. I like when you say stuff that hurts my brain.